Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. So today I'm going to get into the Bigsby installation on the 2006 here. I've got a couple things to go on the 87 as well. I think we're going to do the nut today, so stay tuned for that. But let's get started with this one. Now I wanted to jump right into Bigsby installation, which would have just involved removing the strap pin, putting on the Vibramate tremolo installation system, and then putting it all back together. But as things go with old guitars, I found another interesting issue with this one, and it's very similar to the issue that I had with the red one that I actually didn't show on camera, so I'm glad I got to capture this. But there is a wall anchor in the base of this poor guitar, a blue plastic wall anchor that's meant to secure the strap button. Don't ever do that, folks. It seems tempting, but use a wood dowel or something, okay? So I've got to take this out, we're going to dowel it and repair that. We're going to drill this out, and we're going to try not to enlarge the hole too much so that I don't have a dowel that'll fit it. I've got a 3/16 dowel, I've got a 1/4 inch dowel if worse comes to worse. I think it's probably going to go to that, by the way. Hopefully this anchor comes out. I have already tried to pull it out with a pair of pliers. That is not happening, by the way, and I don't want to lose the head. It is not coming. So I'm going to have to drill it. That's looking promising. I'm getting blue parts here. Got it. Okay. So that's the blue mess. I'll sweep this up and try to figure out if that's a predictable size hole, and if not, we'll have to drill it out to a 1/4. Okay, so this hole was almost a 1/4. Now this is a 1/4 inch poplar hardwood dowel, and what I need is some tight bond. I've done this many times on this channel, so you can find videos on this if you're wanting to see something a little closer up. But basically, I'm just going to load up a dowel with some wood glue on it, and I'm going to get a little bit more wood glue and smear it around inside the hole. And then we're going to run this thing in there. Just tap it home until it bottoms out, and then we'll just clean up the excess with a wet paper towel, which I will go and get shortly. But that's the process. There's not a lot to it. I just need to let that dry before I cut the little excess off. Alright, so the dowel has been set and I have cut it off, and I actually sealed the end of it with some super glue, kind of polished everything over. So we're ready to re-drill this hole for the strap button, and that's just a matter of finding the center, making a little mark. Now I can drill my hole. And now I think we're finally ready for that Bigsby installation. So under normal circumstances, when you install a Bigsby, it just bolts straight to the body. Well, bolts, it screws straight to the body, and then it screws into the heel of the guitar through a couple of holes there. So you're going to end up with a minimum 6 holes in your guitar to install a Bigsby on a Les Paul. But there's a system called a Vibramate that actually will bolt into your bridge studs, or your tailpiece studs rather, and then this system here will screw into that, and it has a smaller plate that attaches to the back side of your Bigsby, and that receives the strap button, and that's how it gets held down at the heel. So I'm going to be using that today, and I'll post a link to an Amazon vendor who sells the Vibramate. I actually got this used, so I didn't actually get it there, but they sell them there, and they actually sell a piece that I'll talk about in a minute for the strap button that would be useful as well. Let's go ahead and install this piece of the Vibramate first, which just involves screwing these down into the bushings and leaving them just a little bit loose, because this Vibramate needs to rotate back just ever so slightly to be able to locate the Bigsby. Now I don't know the exact spec on this, like how tight you're supposed to have these things, but you can feel just a little bit of rotation that you can achieve on this thing without the screws protruding above the surface. That's kind of where I'm going for. I also want to make sure it's tightened down evenly, because it does have a tendency to be able to seat on one side before the other. That looks just about right there. Now you'll know you're right if when you screw this down you end up over the strap button hole with this back part. And by the way, this back part, this plate, just screws in with 4 little screws, but I'm not going to take those out because they are such a bear to get back in. Okay, so we're going to put these screws in here. So I didn't really say it before, but I think it's pretty obvious. The nice thing about the Vibromate is if ever somebody wants to take this Bigsby off this Les Paul, they can do it, and there's really no evidence that it's been there to begin with. Now on this end of the Les Paul, you really just have to hit the strap button hole. The interesting thing is some strap buttons don't fit down into that recess. And even if they did, it's kind of a deep recess, so you might want something to space it out. Now there is a washer that I'll put a link to on Amazon that's designed by Vibromate for this purpose, and it is sold separately from a lot of their kits. I didn't order it because it's like 15 bucks or something, and I'm going to use a little bit less elegant solution and just basically put a nut down in that hole that just fits that space and will take up that slack so that my strap button doesn't go down in there. It just sits on top. Now the other thing I'm going to do, the normal strap button screw is about 1 inch long. I went out and bought 1.25 inch screw. That's a number 6 screw, and it'll go right into that hole. All right, that's very nice, and what's really nice about it is that nothing that would scratch the body is actually touching the heel here on this end. It's got some felt sort of pads or washers on the back side of that Vibromate piece that's going to keep the scratches away from this thing. All right, so this is the parked position of the Bigsby, and this is kind of what it's going to look like. I'm going to get to stringing it here in a second, but what you'll notice about the Bigsby is that you can totally lift up on this arm all the way to the point where the spring will fall out. So that's what's nice about that parked position. If you park it there, your spring's not going to fall out. All right, so moving on to strings. I've strung a Les Paul plenty of times, but I've never strung a Bigsby. I'm going to use a set of 10s on this one, and I'm just going to use these D'Addario XLs. Okay, so as with most tremolo stringing operations, I'm going to start with the low E string side first, just because it's the string that can take the most stress if I happen to be moving the spring around or something like that. Now there's a set of posts that are inside this bar here that you can't see from the angle you're at right now probably, but there's these posts that accept the ball end of the string, and you basically slip the ball end over that, come around the top, and then back under this bar, and then over your bridge. Well, it's definitely not the most fun thing in the world. I can see why people complain about this. I don't know if there's a trick to it or not. It feels like if I was to do anything different, I would probably pre-radius the end of this string a little bit to try to get it to go around that post a little better. That seems to work better. So then we go under and over. So under this post on the Bigsby and then over the bridge. And from there on out, it's pretty normal. All right, so I have no history of this guitar, so I don't know anything about how the neck relief is going to turn out whenever I get it strung. Obviously, this is a brand new bridge. The intonation is not set. I've just got to wait until everything's strung and has set for a little while before I can really and truly get it all dialed in. There's probably a more sophisticated trick to this, but I'm just putting a little bit of a bend in these. A little bit more than maybe 1/3 of a circle, just to kind of get myself onto that little post and starting to wrap around, because if you don't do that, they have a tendency to try to pop back off of that post as you're coming around. That's the way I've figured out how to do it so far, but I'm a Bigsby newbie. And what's weird is like just a little slip, like giving it a little slack, makes it pop right off that stupid post again. So I can see why people don't like these things. Well, while I can get these strings on today, I can tell there is a problem with this nut. I didn't really have a problem until I got to about this D string here, and it really shows that the nut's cut way too deep, so the strings sit not only fairly far down in it, but they actually are resting on that first fret. I mean, you can hear the buzzing from here. I guess I'm gonna have to replace another nut, which I didn't plan on doing on this guitar, but I'm already doing it on the other one, so why not, right? But let's finish up the strings. That might give me a start to getting a read on the neck relief at some point. Okay, well, I'm in the ballpark here, and other than that D string, actually the other strings seem okay. So I'm not sure what I'm gonna do yet, but I do think I am ultimately going to replace that. Let's move on to the red guitar. And we're about to do a nut installation. Now I already removed the old nut, and I did that last time. I don't know if I showed it on camera, but you just need to put a block of wood up against it on the back side and knock it over, and it'll basically fall out. That's assuming that there's not a bunch of glue and other stuff that's been done in there. Mine had a wooden shim under a plastic nut that was glued in like there was no tomorrow. So I have spent quite a bit of time cleaning out this nut socket and trying to kind of flatten it and make sure that I got that shim out of there and all that stuff. I've spent time filing my nut with a file on the bottom side to make sure it's flat. I use smaller files to refine that nut slot. It's a nasty process, but I think I finally got it right. So the nut that I'm using today is a Tusk nut, and this is from Graphtec, and these are made to simulate ivory or bone. They do a pretty good job of it. They are plastic. I like the fact that they are plastic because even though this thing is tough, it's still easy to file. All right, so when I glue this in, I'm just gonna set it in place and glue it in with just a little bit of super glue. You don't need to go overboard. You know, a couple on the bottom, couple against the fretboard, and kind of just set it in place and then hold it and clamp it for a little while. And as long as you've got everything level and it's not gonna move around, that will stay in place forever. All right, so I've glued the nut in place, and like I said, just a couple drops on the bottom and a couple drops on the front, set it in place and clamp it. There's a little bit of sanding involved. You know, you got to make sure that the nut's not too wide and that it fits perfect in that pocket. All right, so I'm gonna put a set of the same strings that I put on the white guitar on this guitar, 10 to 46s basically, and I'm gonna go ahead and string those up, and I need to find the bridge and the tailpiece before I do that. Bridge and tailpiece are now in. Start with the biggest string first. I'm gonna have to play with this tailpiece height adjustment after I get the bridge height adjustment set. Okay, so you may wonder why I'm installing the strings before I slot the nut. It's just the way I do it. If you've seen me slot nuts before, and by the way, I have a quick tip video on slotting a nut, so go ahead and look at that. But if you've seen me slot nuts before, you'll know that I need the strings installed and basically tuned to pitch, and that helps me determine the string height over the first fret as I'm filing the nut. Now I can already tell I'm gonna have to raise this tailpiece because it's touching the back of the bridge here at this point. You know, in some ways it sounds kind of silly to say, but the more you work on Gibsons, the more you'll notice that there was quite a bit of engineering done to these early in the day. The break angle over the nut and the way that you string these things, they really string up very nicely because of that specific angle that they chose for the headstock. Okay, with the strings on, I'm a lot further along now, so I'm gonna do the nut slotting off camera. If you're interested in how to slot a nut, just view my quick tip video on that, and I've got a playlist on quick tip videos. Just go view my playlist and you'll find it. It's not a very difficult process. I've got a set of nut files, and each one's got a specific radius or a specific width or diameter, and I usually pick a couple thousandths bigger than each one of the strings that I've installed. In this case, I've got 10s on here, so it might be slightly different than the quick tip video that you're going to view, but you know, for a 46 I might pick like up to a 52 or so nut file width, and I'll come back to the video when we're about to do the neck relief and the pickup height and the intonation and things like that. All right, well, the red guitar is really coming together now. I've got the nut slotted. It's not shaped yet, but we're close enough to where I've been able to check out a few things. Neck relief is already spot on, didn't have to touch it, so I'll be able to put that truss rod cover on soon. Now the bridge height, I've got it set close. I've got it set right now at 4/64 at the 17th. I'm gonna go ahead and move the tailpiece up just a bit because the strings are touching the back edge of the bridge. So I'm gonna go ahead and raise the tailpiece enough just so it just barely clears that back edge. It still gives me good break angle over the saddle, but it's not going to interfere with anything in terms of string movement. Okay, to do this right, I do need to detune a bit so that these screws here are not under tension. All right, that should be in the ballpark. Now I just need to retune. All right, let's talk intonation just for a second. On intonation, you're adjusting the saddles forward or backward on each one of the strings, and you're doing that so that you tune the entire length of the string versus its halfway point. So we're working on the 12th fret, and we're gonna do the harmonic to test the tuning of the entire string, and then the fretted note to test the tuning of half of the string, and then we're going to adjust our saddle accordingly. With the saddle in this orientation where I've got the screws toward the back, if the note is sharp, I'm going to tighten the saddle screw, which lengthens the string. And if that 12th fret fretted note is flat, I will loosen the screw to shorten the string. And you want to keep going until you get the fretted note to match the harmonic exactly, and then you know your halfway point is spot on with your tuning. I've got my Peterson going, and I'm just going to test the harmonic. All right, that's spot on. Let's test the fretted note, and it's just a hair sharp. So we're going to dial back this saddle here. And we'll see if I can do this without detuning. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. All right, so that's tightened. We're getting closer, so basically what needs to happen is those need to match. Now, some people will argue with me that you shouldn't do intonation with the guitar laying on its back. I found one thing that helps mitigate that just a little bit, and that is to move my stand, my block that the neck is sitting on, up as close to the body as I possibly can, because that's a very strong point and it takes a lot of stress off the curvature of the neck, which really could affect intonation a little bit. So at any rate, you know, you do whatever you feel is right. You can tune with the guitar standing up, you can tune it with the guitar on its back, but just know that there's some controversy about that. And I do intend at some point to do a video on that using the Peterson to kind of show some differences. The same process works for all 6 of the strings. You just go down the line, harmonic versus fretted note, move in the saddle, and then you'll be intonated. So I lost audio for this segment, and I apologize for that. But what I was trying to convey is how to set pickup height. Now the pickup height specs for Gibson are 1/16 inches on the bridge pickup and 3/32 inches on the neck pickup. And I like to convert those to 64ths, so make sure you get yourself a ruler that has 64th gauge measurements on it. So here's an example of my 64th gauge ruler. It's useful for a couple of things. It serves not only as a ruler, but it'll also serve as a fret rocker if you need one, and that's why I really like that tool. Last thing I thought I'd show you is just that I did install the truss rod cover on the red guitar, and that more or less wraps up this one. I do need to shape the nut just a little bit more, but this guitar is mainly done. Okay, so while I'm a little bit stuck on the white one waiting for that nut to arrive, I did go ahead and try to rough in the pickup height, the neck relief, and the intonation and the bridge height. Everything's kind of within spec right now, and I actually really love this bridge. This roller bridge, I tell you, the slightest adjustments in intonation seem to just make a world of difference on this thing. So, you know, I'm really thrilled with the way this thing's working out. I'm probably going to get a tusk nut that's got lubrication built into it, just because with the roller bridge and the nut and the tremolo, I think all those things play well together. I don't have locking tuners, but you know, it is what it is. I say the 498T in this thing is a lot stronger than the 490T that's in the red one. I've heard that about these guitars and these pickups in particular. I'm much more happy with the way this thing sounds. It's just really hard to play because of the way that first fret is buzzing and stuff. So I'll work on another video with the shaping of the nut and maybe the nut installation on this one when it comes in. I'm not going to put it in as part of this series. I'll probably put it in as a quick tip. If you guys ever want to buy a husk and build a project out of a husk, just realize that somebody parted that thing out for a reason. So for example, you might get one that's missing inlays. You might get one that's got some kind of a problem with the nut. It's just, you know, completely messed up, or it's got finish issues that you can't repair, things like that. So just realize that husks are not perfect guitars. You might just turn out with something that ends up being really cool, kind of like I've done here, but it's going to be a lot of work. Appreciate the likes, appreciate the comments, really love the subscriptions, and I'll see you guys next time.